Okay, thanks, Philippe, and thanks everyone for tuning in to the first Conservation Series webinar for 2024. We're really excited to have James from OBWB attend and present to us. James is an expert in his field, and he's probably given this presentation a number of times over the last month, and certainly a number of times over the last couple of years. The format for this one is the usual. James will present. His presentation is going to be around 30 minutes. Then we'll go to Q&A after that. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box on Zoom. And if you have questions on Facebook Live, please put them in the comments. Once James' presentation is done, we will put the questions together and send him his way. Just a friendly reminder that James is not a decision maker. He is more of an expert and someone who tells us all about what's going on and what could happen if we get mussels, and probably what we should do as well to prevent them from coming here. But unfortunately, like in my world, he doesn't get to make the decisions, which we'd probably both like to do on a number of days. So that's kind of the layout. I want to thank you all for attending. I'll give a little bit of background about James here. James and I have known each other for quite a while and actually went to school, I don't know, together, or I think you finished before I finished my thesis, but we've known each other for quite a long time. And the BC Wildlife Federation also has a very good working relationship with the Okanagan Basin Water Board. So James Littley is the Deputy Administrator with the Okanagan Basin Water Board. He manages the OBWB's program to remove invasive milfoil in the Okanagan, is the policy lead to prevent invasive mussels, and is an experienced administrator and project manager. James has over 10 years of management and leadership experience in the Canadian Forces and is a recipient of the Canadian Forces Decoration. He has an MA in Sustainability Policy, BA in Political Science and Human Geography, and a diploma in Local Government Administration. James served 2 4-year terms as a board director for Environment Funders Canada, is a former chair of the BC Water Funders Collaborative Steering Committee, and has volunteered in various other roles. Born and raised in Kelowna, BC, he enjoys gardening and spending time outdoors with his wife and his 2 kids. So James, that's a little bit about you. We'll turn it over to you, and looking forward to it. Thank you to Okanagan Basin Water Board and to you for bringing this and engaging our folks.
Great. Thanks very much for that introduction, Jesse. Thanks to BCWF for having me here today, and for your leadership on this issue and so many other important issues throughout the province. So today I'm going to talk about invasive zebra and quagga mussels and the threat that they pose to BC. And why should we care about this? And you may have heard why that the Okanagan Basin Water Board, which I'll refer to as OBWB, why did we call for a boat ban in the fall? I'm going to get to all of that. But first, can you see the 3 invasive mussels on this boat? This is a boat that came from Quebec through Alberta in 2015. It was stopped by Alberta inspectors, and they notified the BC inspection program, which was new that year, that the boat was coming through. It was ordered to stop at the Cook Road boat launch here in Kelowna, and within about 5 minutes, the inspector pulled this bolt out of the stern and found these 3 invasive mussels. Since starting inspections in 2015, the province has intercepted more than 165 mussel-fowl boats coming into the province. But after 7 years of data collection by the Okanagan and Similkameen Invasive Species Society at local boat launches, only 3/4 of boats coming into the province were being inspected under that program. So who is the Okanagan Basin Water Board? Well, we're a partnership of the 3 Okanagan regional districts and the Okanagan Nation Alliance. Our boundaries are based on the watershed, not political boundaries. And part of our mandate is to define water problems and priorities, the economic feasibility of solutions, responsibility, necessary legislation, and required action. Since 2012, we've run the public outreach program, Don't Move a Mussel, which if you've been through the Okanagan, you may have seen on billboards or bus shelters or heard on the radio. And we also provide an annual gap analysis for regulations, enforcement, and funding to prevent invasive mussels at both the provincial and federal levels. So we're calling for specific actions based on the situation in any given year. And we're not the only ones concerned. Just a few months ago, the U.S. Government Accountability Office called invasive mussels the species of greatest concern to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And if you know anything about that corps, they take care of all sorts of dams and hydro projects and things like that. So we hear a lot about invasive species, and it's very important. Like Jesse mentioned, I run the milfoil removal program, so I'm very well aware of what it takes to, if you can control a species, to do that. Zebra and quagga mussels are different. They will fundamentally alter aquatic ecosystems, have devastating economic impacts, create extreme operational problems for infrastructure, and they will change the way we can recreate on beaches and in the water. These mussels are super filter feeders. Each one can filter a liter of water per day, and they can grow in densities up to 700,000 per cubic meter. Sorry, per square meter. So that means they could filter an Olympic-sized swimming pool or 2.5 million liters every 4 minutes or 350 times a day at that density. That collapses and reorganizes the food chain, starving native fish, but favoring bottom feeding species. So the fish that you still do get, there are less of them and they'd be smaller. It also allows more sunlight penetration, makes the water warmer, and allows more aquatic plants to grow. And in the Okanagan, of course, that would mean more milfoil. So to look at a couple numbers quickly from two examples, in the Hudson River, mussels caused changes similar in magnitude to toxins, nutrient pollution, or acid rain. Microzooplankton was reduced by 70%, and phytoplankton was reduced by 80%. Native mussel populations became threatened or endangered. In multiple lakes in Minnesota, studies show that walleye, a popular fishery there, grew 14% slower in infested lakes. Although I have to say, the more I read, the more the exact effects on specific fisheries and specific waters can depend on many factors. And this is what our beaches could look like. This is a global news photo from Lake Winnipeg taken in 2015, only 5 years after mussels were first detected in that lake. They have about a 4-year lifespan, and then they begin to die off and the billions of shells wash up on the beaches. In this photo, in some places, the mussel shells were 2 feet deep. So let's do a little bit of math. Remember the 3 mussels on the boat from Quebec that I showed on the first slide? Let's say that one of those mussels is a female, and they get into the water and reproduce. At a low rate, the female would produce 40,000 eggs in one release. Let's say 10% of them survive and turn into female mussels and 10% male. Within 3 generations at that low rate, there would be 64 billion mussels from that one female. And again, that's a low rate of egg release and only a 20% survival rate. Each of those mussel shells on the beach are only the size of your thumbnail, and the shells are razor sharp. They're also a hazard while they're attached. So this is a photo, again, Lake Michigan. Somebody jumped in and got caught in the waves. They had to go down and push themselves up to get out of the waves and back onto the dock. And they sliced their feet up on the mussels attached to the rocks in the bottom of the lake. This is what the mussels look like under the water. They attach to any hard surface with these little strings of proteins called byssal threads. And each mussel can produce up to 600 byssal threads. And they can then trap bacteria and cause corrosion on the surfaces that they attach to. Even after the mussels are cleaned off, the byssal threads continue to corrode concrete, inside pipes and things like that. In their larval stage, before they form shells, the mussels are microscopic, meaning, of course, that they can get almost anywhere that water can get. Then they settle and attach. This is a water intake pump in Texas that had to be removed and cleaned. In some cases, facilities have had to twin their water intake systems so they can shut down one at a time to clean the other. Here's what a water intake pipe looks like with invasive mussels. So there's this massive expense to cleaning and maintaining drinking water supplies or retrofitting infrastructure. This is what your prop could look like if it sits in the water for too long. Keep in mind that any water inlets for cooling, ballast tanks, the hull of the boat, Anything that sits in the water and anywhere that water goes can get covered in these mussels. How fast can they be covered in these mussels? Well, this is a section of pipes. The one on the left is newly installed. And then after just 2 months, 4 months, and only 6 months from sitting in mussel infested water, that's what the pipe looks like. And these sections were from Lake Mead in Nevada. The mussels can also grow on each other, causing these thick clumps of shells to block pipes or break off and damage equipment. So you can imagine that again in your outboard motor. And this shows how they can reach those densities of 700,000 per square meter. So I'm just going to run 3 or 4 little slides and let the pictures talk for themselves for a minute. And so this one bears some explanation. This is a photo from the journal Science, published in March 2023, showing a zebra mussel attached to a lake chub. You might be able to see it with my cursor right here. This is the first recorded occurrence of an invasive mussel attached to a fish. So if this is possible, would it be possible for something like this to happen in the Columbia with anadromous fish swimming upstream instead of the mussel larva simply floating downstream? It's concerning to think about. There is already ways that they can spread upstream, but not as quickly as they would if they can attach to fish like this. So these billions of mussels also start excreting excess nutrients into the water. And after about 4 years of consuming all the healthy food, they create this crystal clear water. The first generation begins to die off, leaving huge amounts of biological material and creating toxins like botulism and E. coli. Large algae blooms in the Great Lakes have also been partly attributed to invasive mussels and exacerbated by climate change. I mentioned botulism in the last slide. This is a photo from wildlife biologists in Michigan where thousands of dead loons and other birds washed up on beaches. These were killed by a strain of botulism that were caused by a complex set of effects from the zebra mussels. And to me, this image is striking because the birds are lying there dead on dead mussels, which ultimately caused their deaths. It's estimated that the mussels bioaccumulate organic pollutants in their tissues by as much as 300,000 times compared to what's in the water. So if you eat some of the fish or crayfish that can consume the mussels, these concentrated toxins and pollutants can be passed up the food chain. And yes, before you ask, there are some species of fish that can eat the mussels, but no, they can't control the populations, and many of them will die from eating the mussels. So I've shown some of the effects on the ecosystem and on infrastructure, but now I'm going to talk about economic loss a little bit. In May last year, the province released a new estimate showing that if these mussels get into the province, they could cost up to $129 million per year, with up to $92.5 million for infrastructure costs, $8.1 million for extra maintenance on boats and marinas, $12.6 million in lost profits and revenue from tourism, and $30.2 million in annualized loss of property value and lost property taxes. But what the economic analysis does not show is the loss of the ecosystem or the ecosystem effects and loss of fish that I just talked about. It doesn't talk about loss of filtration deferral for municipal infrastructure. So, you know, these places that right now might not need filtration plants might then need to build these very, very expensive filtration plants. And it also doesn't account for loss of private intakes. So this is a map of the province based on temperature and calcium. And it's an average of waters in a region, not every specific lake, showing the risk of invasive mussels. So the red is the highest risk of infestation, the yellow is a moderate risk, and the green low risk. But the white, all that big chunk of the province, especially in the north that's white, just means there isn't enough data for them to do this analysis yet. The problem is there's some variation between regions and even within water bodies. So I'll show a map of the Okanagan in a second, but just because one region appears to be green, it doesn't mean that your favorite fishing lake isn't actually red. And what's the actual difference between moderate and high risk? I haven't been able to find a source that says what a moderate infestation is compared to a high infestation. And I know that's not the same as risk, but we've seen some lakes where they didn't seem to have the right conditions, and then the mussels came in and they were able to survive there. So in Lake Michigan, when we're talking about a like a high density versus a low density, in Lake Michigan, zebra mussels were first introduced and reached densities of only about 900 per square meter. And quagga mussels then were introduced and outcompeted and displaced them, so that by 2005, the quagga mussels had reached densities of 7,800 per square meter, or nearly 9 times the density. And again, that's only a fraction of the highest potential density for these species. I mentioned 700,000 per square meter would be a high density. If there's aquatic plants in the water, they can grow on the stems of those. And the highest source I could find for any estimate was up to 10 million per, I guess it would have been a cubic meter in that section. So just astounding numbers. Even at these relatively low densities, the negative effects are essentially the same. So what we can take from this map is that the vast majority of the province, including the Fraser and Columbia, every major population center, and every hydropower region, producing region, including the new Site C, is at risk. So whether directly or only in the pocketbook, this will affect all British Columbians. And I think it's important because a lot of the messaging has come out of the Okanagan Basin Water Board and the Shuswap Watershed Council and partners in the Columbia. But if you look at the lower mainland here, and you look at the southern tip where Victoria is, they're also at risk for these mussels. So here's just another way to consider that same type of data. The map on the left is based on specific water testing sites. And so you can average those areas and take an average of the lake and say, okay, this section is at moderate risk and these sections are at high risk. But again, that's just the risk for introduction. So if this is high risk for introduction, you're going to end up with something like this where the whole lake is high risk. I will point out in the Okanagan, at least, some of our high elevation lakes and reservoirs are lower risk, and that's based on calcium content. But you can see how, depending on how you parse the data, they can be low risk in some areas. And then the overall, though, there are higher risk areas in the same lakes. And again, that can be because there's calcium content from certain rocks or outcroppings in certain areas of the lake. So my point here with this map and the previous map is that we have to be very careful to not assume that something is not at risk unless it absolutely doesn't meet the parameters at all for habitat for the mussels. So talking about prevention for just a second, and I'll come back to this, but this is the inspection station map for 2023 for the summer. And what I want to point out here, first, I want to say that the conservation officers and provincial staff really do an outstanding job, but they are severely under-resourced. They don't have enough funding or inspectors to do really what they need to be doing. So these green/blue, whatever color you call that, dots are what you call permanent inspection stations, but that's not what you would think of as permanent. Those stations are seasonal. They are not open 24 hours or even dawn to dusk in some cases. And if you come on a different route into the province, or if you come on one of these routes while the station is closed or out of season, there is no legal requirement for you to report for an inspection before launching into BC waters. So that's a big time gap. Funding and staffing have also been cut. I'll talk about that again. And I'm going to come back to talk more about these gaps and calls to action. But first, I have to talk about what just happened a few months ago when mussels were discovered closer than they've ever been. On September 18th, Idaho announced that they had detected quagga mussel larvae in the Snake River at Twin Falls. So down here, the bottom right is Twin Falls, Idaho, and this red line is the Snake River as it flows north into this confluence with the Columbia. The blue line is the Columbia where it comes out of the Kootenays, and the green line is the Okanagan River. And then I left this section of the Columbia in purple because it's downstream of the infestation. So if they weren't successfully eradicated, which any expert will tell you is unlikely, then this should all be considered high risk. And you'll note that the Snake River goes through Idaho into Washington state and then along the border of Washington and Oregon. So it's fair to assume that all of those states could be high risk, and they're going to need to have internal inspection stations between potentially infested water, high risk water, and the water that hasn't been infested or there hasn't been a detection yet. The drive from Twin Falls to Osuyus Lake is 11 hours, but the drive from the confluence of the Snake and Columbia to Osuyus Lake is only 4.5 hours. So it would be very easy to bring a boat with, a little bit of standing water within the time that the mussels can survive out of water and introduce it into lakes in BC now. This is the closest they've ever been. So what happened? Well, multiple water samples, and you can see by the white and yellow dots here and red dots, tested positive for quagga mussel larvae. What does that mean? Once fertilized as an egg, a mussel can become an adult and attach to a surface within 3 to 5 weeks. Within 8 weeks, the mussel can reach sexual maturity. A large female mussel can release 1 million eggs in a reproductive season. And reports from warmer waters like Lake Mead indicate that mussels can release eggs up to 6 times per year. In addition to the larvae in the water samples, Idaho divers also found a single adult mussel attached in 16 feet of water on the bottom of a rock, indicating that, of course, there was already an undetected population in the Snake River. And you can imagine how hard it would be to find a mussel or a mussel population even the size of a thumbnail in the first generation in an area of fast flowing water like that, and yet they found it. Idaho's rapid response was to dump 116,000 liters of chelated copper into the Snake River. And so they were going to follow that with another pesticide and a biological treatment in the spring. What did this do? Well, it killed mussels in the river, including native mussels. It killed other invertebrates. It killed fish. It killed plants. It killed algae. It killed amphibians. Like I said, over 116,000 liters or almost 4 of this tanker truck full of copper pesticide. They basically poisoned a 26-kilometer stretch of the river before the dilution went below lethal levels. I can't imagine pulling a truck like this up filled with anything to any of our lakes in BC. But this was considered a better option in Idaho than letting the mussels survive. And unfortunately, there's no guarantee that it worked. There aren't many photos of the fish kill from this treatment, but reports indicate that state officials recovered between 6 and 7 tons of dead fish, including 35-year-old 8-foot-long hatchery sturgeon. This photo is from the Fraser River, which we all know is at risk for invasive mussels based on its water chemistry from that map I showed. This is the size of the sturgeon, and the entire population in that section of the river was killed. And I did a little bit more research on sturgeon. They can eat invasive mussels, but the mussels are 4 times less food value than the food that the sturgeon would normally eat, which the mussels would filter out. And they interfere with the sturgeon's ability to access their preferred lake bottom food. the sturgeon also can't consume enough mussels to control the population. So again, you end up with less smaller fish with less food to consume. The other option for mussel control is one that happened last year in Highline Lake, Colorado, where they drained the lake. And this is a small reservoir, not a big lake. The drawdown happened in February 2022, and in March 2023, the remaining water was treated again with the copper pesticide. Unfortunately, in November, Colorado State staff found more zebra mussels in the lake, which is again closed to boaters and which is again going to be drained and treated with an even larger dose of the chemicals. So this obviously wouldn't work for any of the lakes, certainly not in the size of the lakes in the Okanagan. Now, I know that there was some concern about the OBWB and others calling for a temporary boat ban on out-of-province boats coming into BC. And I'll just say the boat ban was intended to allow time to assess the level of infestation and the success of the treatment in Idaho. That would take at least till spring, till the mussels would start reproducing. And it was also to give the province time to address the gaps that I'm going to talk about in the inspection system. At least one person, though, called our call to action to have a temporary boat ban, referred to it as using a sledgehammer to swat a fly and overreacting to a problem that isn't even here yet. So I think this image is instructive. This is a map of all the boats that were stopped only at Montana inspection stations in 2014, showing their points of origins using postal codes. So the yellow dots are Montana's inspection station. You'll note that there are far more there than there are in BC. And all the green dots are the watercraft that are coming through. So you can also look at all the boats going between Alberta and Montana. In 2019, when they had the most inspection stations in BC, the longest hours for the inspection stations and the most inspectors, BC inspected more than 50,000 boats coming into the province. So I wonder what a similar map for BC and Idaho would look like. So where are we currently with prevention? As I mentioned, inspection is required only if you're driving past an open inspection station. There is no requirement currently to remove the drain plug from your boat when you're out of the water. I didn't mention these things can close their shells and live for up to 30 days out of the water. They can live as long as they need to, as long as there's a food source in standing water. So having that drain plug pulled indicates that you've at least removed water from your vessel. The Canadian Border Service Agency has not been consistent with inspections at all crossings, and the BC inspection budget has been cut, and there's been a staffing shortage over the last few years. BC historically has also relied on a perimeter defense system. So they would count on states like Idaho and Montana, Alberta and Saskatchewan to stop boats and notify them before they got here. So there's kind of an outer perimeter that would notify us. So the rationale was our inspections didn't need to be full-time. Not every boat needed to be inspected because that outer perimeter would catch infested boats as well. Obviously, we're sharing a border with an infested area now or potentially high-risk area, so that's no longer a reliable defense strategy. BC's early detection and rapid response plan hasn't been updated since 2015, so that's what allowed Idaho to dump the chemicals in the river. I'm not suggesting that's something we should do, but that's the type of plan that was in place, and we don't have that type of plan updated for almost 10 years here. There's also no regional plans in place for when a detection occurs. So if one lake in BC gets a detection, what do we do to stop it from getting into other lakes? And as I mentioned, OBWB is calling for a temporary moratorium on out-of-province boats until the full status of the infestation in the Columbia Basin is assessed, or until every boat coming into BC is required to be inspected. And this is not unprecedented. Idaho has a system, Montana and some other states have a system where you have to buy a sticker when you come in from out of the state, and it's not very expensive, and you have to buy it on an annual basis, and it shows that you've gone through an inspection. So it funds itself in that case. I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily the way to go, but we have to have something in place where you can, maybe you report to a marina that's qualified to inspect or something, but everyone should be required to have an inspection if they're bringing their boat from out of province. So just to boil those down, this is what we've called for from the province: the temporary out of province boat ban, introducing pull the plug legislation. We're the only province in Western Canada that allows you to keep your drain plug in while you're transporting over the roads. We're asking the province to commit $4 million per year, indexed to inflation for 10 years for the invasive mussel defense program. We got that number because that's what it cost to do the inspection program in 2019 when they stopped 50,000 boats, including, I believe, about 2,500 high-risk boats. We want enhanced funding and recruiting for inspections. They want to update the early detection and rapid response plan, to create and lead regional planning processes, again, for what happens if they're detected in one region of the province. And we want them to promote vulnerability assessments for our infrastructure to allow us to look at what's going to happen if mussels come, and allow infrastructure managers to get things in place in advance just to mitigate the effects to the extent possible. And then from the federal government, we're asking for immediate direction to border agents from Saskatchewan west to inspect all watercraft coming into Canada. The reason it's Saskatchewan west is because the mussels have also been spreading from the east. So I showed Lake Winnipeg. Again, just in November, they've now hit what is it called? Clear Lake and Mountain Riding National Park in in Manitoba, and that's 100 kilometers further west than they had ever been before. So they're encroaching from the south and from the west. We want the feds to support a temporary boat ban from out of province, and to commit to matching provincial funding for invasive mussel inspection programs throughout the West. You probably saw BCWF released a couple weeks ago, and we followed suit that federal government funding has been cut. And then Fortis BC, who used to fund the program, said, well, if the feds aren't going to provide leadership, neither are we. And BC Hydro has cut their funding. We don't know what that funding from the feds is going to look like, but as far as we know right now, they just are not providing any funding. And so finally, we're not just calling for action from senior government. As I mentioned, OBWB, as a relatively small agency, we have a total of 10 staff, including our milfoil operators. We run the Don't Move a Mussel campaign for public outreach. We've almost completed an infrastructure vulnerability assessment guide, which we're going to share throughout the Pacific Northwest. And on March 8th, there's a first meeting for a new invasive mussel working group. It is going to be focused to begin with on the Okanagan interior, but it's a way to help the province develop a regional plan and a regional framework to look at how do we increase prevention. How do we deal with a situation where there's an infestation detected in BC and stop it from spreading? And then, God forbid, the mussels should get into BC. How do we learn to live with them? What do we have to do to prepare for this? What is it going to mean? You know, how do we prepare the public for the extreme costs? Is there anything we can do to protect the ecosystem? How do we coat infrastructure or change our processes for drinking water? All of those things. What does a regional plan look like for going forward? So that's the end of my presentation. Again, thank you for having me. And Jesse, I'm happy to take questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Awesome. Thanks, James. As always, very well done. We got a couple of questions in the hopper, and if folks on Facebook Live or on Zoom here have questions, put them in the Q&A, please, on Zoom, and then in the comment section. First question, are the mussels edible?
No, as I mentioned, they can bioaccumulate toxins, so you wouldn't want to eat them. They're the size of your thumbnail, so I imagine the meat, if you will, inside them is, it would take an awful lot of energy. You'd probably take more energy than you'd consume, and they're not a very good food source even for things that can eat them. They just don't have the nutritional value.
Awesome. This a couple of questions regarding the chemical treatment in the States. For the first one, Was there any consideration for salvaging non-target species before the pesticide application in Idaho?
There wasn't time to do that. So all of they could do is go out and do a quick fish survey because they wanted to get the chemicals in the water. I think between the time they detected the mussels and the time they got the chemicals in the water was less than 2 weeks. And part of that was a delay because there wasn't enough of that copper chelate chemical available. And so they had to contact the chemical manufacturer on the East Coast and have all these trucks brought in. So they enhance the manufacturing capacity from that chemical just to be able to dump it into the river. But they felt if they let it go any farther, they risked, letting the horse out of the barn.
Awesome. Another one related to the chemical application. It says 4 tanker trucks of pesticide into a body of water. Is this an emergency response that would normally not be legal?
Sorry, what was the specific example? The first couple of words?
It's around the tanker trucks. It's around putting chemicals in. And the question really is this an emergency response that would normally not be legal? And we'll deal with that question first.
Yeah, so actually, Canada has approved potassium salt potash as a potential treatment for invasive mussels in Canada. And the province, like it's fully registered, so the province could show up and dump it into a lake if they decide to within a couple of weeks. The problem is we've seen it fail over and over again. Like we've seen this response in Lake Winnipeg. Like I said, it was discovered around 2013 or 2015 for the first time. The mussels were there, and they curtained off 4 harbors and dumped potash into those 4 harbors. And they killed all the mussels in those 4 harbors. And then 2 weeks later, I was at a meeting where one of the legislators at that time stood up and said, mission accomplished. And everyone kind of cheered, and I didn't cheer. And then I stood up and I said, you're celebrating too early. Give this another week. And I mentioned that a single female mussel can produce 1 million eggs per year, or sorry, per reproductive cycle. Where they are reproducing, there's between like 1 and 500 individual mussel larvae per liter of water. And so if you can't control the flow of water, you're not going to control the flow of the mussel larvae once they've, been released from those sacs.
Awesome. And then the question was, where might I find more info on what is legal to put into bodies of water? You can take that on if you want.
Yeah, there's a pesticide management regulatory agency in Canada, and so only because I just did this vulnerability assessment guide, I'm a little bit familiar with this. So it has to be approved by, I think it's through Health Canada, that agency is through, and then also by the province. So there's some approved chemicals and non-approved chemicals, and either way, you should get a qualified environmental professional and go through the process of making sure that's legal. Don't dump anything in the water unless you have the proper permits and authority to do so.
Great. Why does calcium content have a role in defining the risk factor in lakes and streams?
Yeah, so the mussels need, I believe it's more than 12 milligrams per liter of calcium to form their shells. And they need a slightly higher content than that in order for the larva to kind of survive and start growing. So of course the larva, like with any species, the babies are more vulnerable than the adults. But I believe the threshold is like anything over 12 milligrams per liter allows them to form shells and therefore survive. And there's no upper threshold for calcium. So as long as it's calcium that can be used, because I'm not a chemist or even a scientist, but I know that there's some calcium that's available and some that's like locked away and not available. But as long as there's that 12 milligrams per liter of available calcium, that's one of the primary factors for allowing them to establish in a water body.
Awesome. The questions are starting to flow here. That's why I'm back and forth between both of my screens. One question, how do I get involved with working group and inspections? Has there been use of volunteers? Has it been considered? Is it viable?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Right now, it's in a very introductory phase. So we have one meeting planned. It's in Kelowna. The intention for the working group right now is, at least for the first meeting, to involve First Nations, local government staff, tourism agencies like the tourism associations, marina operators, and folks that are working kind of directly in and about the water. So the local BCWF chapters in the Okanagan will likely be invited as well. It's not meant yet for the general public because we'll have to figure out kind of what that looks like. But it's just in this, like right now, it only exists in my head, aside from I put out some information. So it's very, very early days for the working group. But if people are interested, they can get a hold of me. My contact information is on the obwb.ca website. And it's james.littley@obwb.ca.
Thanks, James. Now the next question. Okay, and there's a few around inspections. So can you just take us through, maybe even in the States, like how do you kill them? Like if a boat shows up, how do you kill them? And then what is the protocol, if mussels are found? So maybe just take us through those steps. Like a boat shows up, it's positive. Here are the things we do. Maybe in British Columbia. And if you want to compare them to what goes on in the States, that's great too.
Yeah, let's take it a step back before that. Let's say a boat shows up and you don't know if it's positive. So the basis of an inspection is like, where did you come from and how long have you been out of the water? So if you're coming from a lake in Alberta, which is not at risk right now, they say, oh, you were in Alberta. Did you clean, drain, and dry your boat? And you say yes, and your drain plug is out and your boat looks generally clean. They're just going to maybe give you some information and say, have a nice day, right? It's like nothing to declare. If you say, well, I came from Lake Winnipeg and I was there, I'm there during the summer and I was just bringing my boat here for the end of the summer for a long weekend or something, and I drove straight through without stopping, and then you're a high risk boat because you just came out of high risk water. You haven't been out of the water 30 days. And there's a flow chart that tells them if you're high risk or not. So then what they can do is they can say, okay, did you clean, drain, dry your boat? Then they do a physical inspection. And they may issue you a quarantine. So they might put a little tag on your motor and say you cannot cut this tag off for 30 days. And then when 30 days has passed, you will have to either report to a conservation officer or they'll meet you somewhere, or they might say be able to do it on a video phone call and say, okay, show me your tag is still intact and all of that sort of stuff. So even if you get a quarantine, it doesn't have to be a huge hassle. And the other part is a decontamination. So the difficult part, like we want everyone to clean, drain, and dry their boat, but not everyone has all of the attachments. Let's say you've got a wake boat or something like that. You need to be able to flush the ballast. You need to be able to get all of the cooling intakes in your motor cleaned out. And the inspectors have the tools to do that properly. They use the proper temperature of water. And they have the proper PSI for your pressure washer when they're cleaning it. Those Bissell threads that I mentioned are so strong that there have been 6 industrial adhesives developed based on that like biological adhesion, those bonds. So cleaning your boat off, you almost need uh, like a destructive level of pounds per square inch to clean it. And they need to be exposed to like 60 degrees Celsius water for 10 seconds to make sure that the mussels are killed.
Wow.
And
Okay.
I'll
Yep.
mention, if you decide you don't want to pull over for the inspection station, they will chase you down and issue you an expensive ticket.
Perfect. How do the mussels affect our drinking water?
Yeah, so the water quality, like I showed that one image of the green water, so they can create huge algae blooms. Um, they like for the first year or two, they might be okay. But after they start dying off, now you've got a whole bunch of rotting material in your drinking water. And then that doesn't include like just the source water quality turns awful, right? And the algae and things that they put into the water, it's like botulism and E. coli, things you don't want to drink, the toxic blue-green algae. Um, and then once they get into the intake pipes, now your costs for treatment go way up as well. And then for cleaning the pipes and all of that stuff goes way up. So it poor water quality to begin with, and then higher cost of delivery for your drinking water once it gets to your tap.
Thank you. Okay, this is a good one. As the don't move mussel, it is like they have it in the States. It's obviously spreading, so it's not necessarily working. Will we look to force boat owners coming into the province to go through a chemical treatment at owners' expense as done in Lake Tahoe, a mussel-free lake?
I can't answer that. Like that's a long-term policy question, but what I would say is like that maybe that's a discussion we need to have, right? Like that's part of what the idea of the working group is let's see what people are willing to do. And that's part of the reason I wanted to present to the BCWF today, because you guys are boat owners and fishermen and care about the environment, but you're also like the people with the boats to protect, right? And the lakes to defend and those sorts of things. Um, we have to make decisions, value judgments about what we're willing to accept in any given region or body of water, right? Like the chemicals, I said they're not effective in big bodies of water. Maybe there are some small lakes or reservoirs or old gravel pits that we could accept using chemicals in. I don't know. Those are all like big discussions that we need to have kind of as a society to find out what we're willing to do to preserve our environment and to preserve our boats and all of those sorts of things.
Okay, this one is might be a little bit more challenging to answer. Where did the copper go? Did it go into the riverbed? What's the half-life and long-term impacts? So maybe.
Um, I knew all of this while it was happening. I think it was more like a dilution thing. So it's about the concentration of the copper and the fact that they put it in flowing water. So I mentioned it was a 26-kilometer stretch of the river. Like they put it in multiple locations upriver, and it reached non-lethal levels after being diluted 26 kilometers down. I know that the river was flowing at about 500 cubic meters per second, I think, in that stretch. But I can't do the math in my head about what that looks like for dilution. I think that it diluted within maybe a week or two. But like I said, that was after everything in that stretch of river was already dead.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any biocontrols being investigated?
Yeah, thank you. So there is something called Zequinox, and it's registered for use in Canada and the States. Um, my understanding is that it's like the cell wall of a common bacterium that's in soil, and it's pretty much completely innocuous. But I think when the mussels consume it, like they're selective filter feeders. So when they eat something that is not good for them, they can spit it out, but they can't recognize this particular cell as a toxin to them. And so it doesn't do any harm to anything else, but when they eat it, it destroys their digestive system. The problem again, though, is how could you ever release the dosages of even that in a large lake? And of course, it's a proprietary technology, which would make it very expensive. So Zequinox could be, it's a biocontrol. I believe it's innocuous to everything else, but it would be prohibitively expensive and probably not realistic in large bodies of water.
Awesome. Where are the mussels naturally occurring, and how is their population naturally controlled there?
Yeah, that's a good question that I get often. And there's a really fantastic new paper. It was published in 2022. What we know and don't know about invasive zebra mussels, zebra and quagga mussels. So if you Google that, what we know and don't know about invasive zebra and quagga mussels, you'll find that paper, and it's open source. What it says is that they're from kind of the Caspian Sea region, and they've been around and known about for several hundred years. And what really started spreading them was the shipping lanes when they opened up in Europe. And these things have been spreading across Europe for a couple hundred years, and then were introduced to North America in the 80s, and have just been spreading since the 1980s. I think the first was 1988. What controls them? Well, I can't say specifically that they're controlled anywhere. Like they do have some natural limitations, the calcium content, high saline water. If the temperatures aren't warm enough, they can't spawn. There could be like eutrophic lakes or lakes with high nutrient content that can be a limiting factor. Like there are factors that will control them. But again, that takes us back to that map of what's at risk and what's not at risk. So they're not going to spread absolutely everywhere, but they're going to spread enough that they're going to do severe damage most places and affect, power generation and water and all sorts of things.
Great. We'll kind of shift gears a little bit. There's a lot, there's a few questions around, you've got some great solutions. And feel free like to talk how you can or may. What's the response from the provincial government and the federal government? Are you gaining traction? Is the outlook positive? Whatever you can divulge would be great.
Yeah, it's difficult to know what the government's thinking. I will say when we started this in about 2012, 2013, there were no inspection stations in place. And we and others called for inspections, and we had 5 calls to action. And I remember at the time, Christy Clark came to West Kelowna and announced that they were doing all 5 things that we had called for. Since then, like the program built up until 2019, which was the height of inspection program. The best resource, the best staffed, the most boats stopped. And after 2019, I think partly because of COVID, they had problems staffing. The budgets were reduced. The federal government, frankly, the federal government has almost like abandoned the West and Western water in a lot of ways. They used to come out and fund here. They haven't done much. I don't want to go. I don't want to overstate things because I'm still a public servant. But they have not been at the table, and they need to do a better job. The province, as a government, has been upping their budget, but they're still relying on these partnerships. And I think it's time for them to just fund the program and demand that the federal government fund the program. So we have seen traction on a few things. We've seen foot dragging on a few things. A few things that we've called for have been, pretty much outright dismissed. Like we're not considering this at this time, like making inspections mandatory. But the interesting thing is my board directors were with one of the ministers at the Union of BC Municipalities in September. And they had a meeting on Tuesday, and the message from the minister was basically like, this isn't that high priority for us. And then 2 hours later, the news out of Idaho came in. And on Thursday, there was another meeting with the minister, and he said, okay, tell us what we need to do. And I know that ministry staff were down in Idaho. The ministry staff have been outstanding. The minister has taken this seriously. I think it just takes a little bit of time for these things to go through. And the more pressure we can place on both levels of government, the better. They don't like having to answer the same letter on the same subject for months at a time from multiple sources, from every sector of society. So we need to let the government know what's important, and that's what really is a catalyst for action.
Awesome. A lot of people asking, like, if we have time, what can we do? How do we increase the profile in the public? How do we take care of our lakes? There's quite a few here. What can we do to help? So the question is, what can we do? How do we make this happen?
Yeah, so if you're not already clean draining and drying your boats between water bodies, that's like the number one thing that you can do as a boat owner. Just make sure, and it goes for other invasive species, of course, too. That's the practice for boat owners for invasive species. Look at some of the media articles that have come out recently, or we have stuff on don'tmoveamussel.ca that talks about our calls to action. If you want to write to the Minister of Environment or the Minister of what's it called now, Walrus, Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship.
You got it.
Yeah, I think that would go a long way. The more the letters that they get, that's good. And then at the federal level, write to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. You don't have to say much. You can say we're worried about invasive mussels and we support the Okanagan Basin Water Board's calls to action. and they will know what you're talking about. Their staff will know what you're talking about. So those are some things. And then, yeah, through forums like this, we get the word out. And of course, just talking to people. I think most people have like a passing familiarity with this, but they don't realize until they see a presentation like what I gave today, they don't realize really what we're talking about with invasive mussels. And we need to tell people like, this is worse than you think it is. You know, this is more important. This is going to hit you on your electric bill, whether or not you play at the beach or own a boat. Um, yeah, we need to make it personal for people, and not to mention, like I'm born and raised in Kelowna. I take pride in the water and the environment that we have in BC, and I think that people move here because of what we have for an environment. So who wants to lose that? And isn't that worth fighting for, right? And worth speaking up for and worth spreading the message about.
Awesome. Yeah, and in our world, we say, a form letter is worth this much, a letter is worth this much. A meeting with your MP is off the charts. So if you have the time and you can meet with your MP and your MLA regularly, that's where you really are able to influence. If you're part of an association, or if you're one of our members, or you're part of a chamber of commerce or any kind of group, getting your group to get behind this, to prevent it, to make sure that our borders are safe, because it's not just about mussels, it's also about whirling disease. There's a whole bunch of threats that are surrounding us. James, I think you have some volunteers here already based on the questions or maybe comments. There's a whole bunch of people that want to help, so I'm excited for your forum. One here around the protocol, clean your boat with 60-degree water. Would it not be better to promote the 30-day drought as mandatory once mussels are found?
Yeah, I should clarify, like that's a decision that the inspectors make. If mussels are found, I think that a 30-day quarantine is mandatory. So when I'm talking about decontaminations, I think if you're a high-risk boat and mussels are not found, they will still decontaminate you, or they can decontaminate and give you a quarantine, right? So I'm not that familiar with the intricacies, but the very highly trained conservation officers and auxiliary conservation officers who do the inspections, they know certainly what they're doing, and they've learned, like, again, the provincial staff and COs do a really excellent job. They interact with the states and the provinces around us, and they learn from each other, and they share information and databases. That wasn't like that 10 years ago. So there has been progress, but the problem is that they're under-resourced and they don't have the legislation that they need in place. I'll just say about the pull the plug legislation. I haven't reported this to my board yet, but I'm going to next week. The province, we've been calling for pull the plug legislation for more than 5 years now. And the province has said, yeah, we're thinking about it, we're thinking about it. And now they're saying, we're thinking about it as part of the Wildlife Act review, which is great, except that's not slated to wrap up until 2026. And they're not even slated to really do the public consultation until 2025. And this is such a minor thing. Like when we wrote the last letter about pull the plug legislation, we copied what's in place in Saskatchewan and Alberta and Manitoba. And it's literally like one sentence with one sub-sentence. You shall not transport a water vessel over land or on a trailer with the drain plug in place. So I know that they need to do consultation on the broader Wildlife Act, and I totally support that. But it seems like they're wrapped up around the process and not the outcome right now. When what they could do is put that legislation into place right now, and then if they need to change it or amend it, they can look at that with the Wildlife Act review. Right? It's like, don't let perfect be the enemy of good.
Yeah, and the reality of those kind of things, that's kicking the can down the road, to be perfectly honest. We always hear, well, we can do that the next time we overhaul the act, or we can put in the regs. What that means is it's just not a priority.
Yeah.
Really, quite frankly, if they say we'll do it in 2026 or whenever, it's just not important. It's not that important. More of here's a couple technical questions. Is there anything to counteract the calcium?
There are ways to reduce calcium in the water. Again, I'm not a chemist. And there are other things like you could increase the pH or decrease the pH, or like there are things that will limit these, but how can you do that for a large lake, an entire ecosystem? And then what else will it affect, right? If you increase the pH, you're gonna kill a bunch of other stuff or destroy the habitat for a bunch of other stuff. Similar with, there are other things that will need calcium in the water, other native mussels that are already at risk or endangered. Yeah, there's a lot of chemistry. I showed you one source. This is the other thing that's, sorry, my background's blurred. This is the other thing that's sitting on my desk. Like it's a thick volume, and there's a big chapter here on water chemistry that I have to ask my colleague to explain to me because I'm not I don't have a chemistry background. So there are things that will, change that, but it won't do it in isolation for the negative mussels, right?
Here's a local knowledge question. I noticed that Oyama Lake Reservoir wasn't rated for risk on the Okanagan slide. Was it not assessed, or was it assessed and found to not be at measurable risk due to calcium levels?
Yeah, I would have to look again specifically, but as I mentioned, the upper valley lakes for the most part in the Okanagan don't have that 12 milligram per liter threshold. And again, within any given water body, there might be one or two that do have it, or one section. And that map is based on information that's not quite up to date for what we now understand going through the chemical analysis of the life cycle. But yeah, in general, our high mountain reservoirs in the Okanagan are not at risk the same way as our big valley bottom lakes.
Awesome. Another question, is there anyone in the Caribou to inspect or check boats?
So the farthest north, where is it? Around, I think, yeah, I don't think so. It's whatever, like on the Yellowhead, I think they have an inspection station. And that would be the farthest north, I think, that they have it. I'd have to go back to my map or whatever. The inspection station maps and annual reports of how many boats they inspected, how many were high risk, how many mussel-foul boats came in, those are all available online at the provincial website. So if you type in BC Invasive Mussel Defense Program, and just follow a link or two, you'll get all the reports, and they have a ton of information about what the province has done.
Awesome. Okay, we're over an hour in. So, James, on behalf of BCWF and our membership, we really want to thank you for coming in again. I know we've had you on talking to our folks in the past. I'm getting the impression that you're probably going to get an invite to the BCWF AGM this year in Kelowna as well to talk about this. In our world, as you said, we did issue a press release. From our perspective, there is no federal leadership coming on this file. We have mussels knocking on our door. We have whirling disease, which will be catastrophic for our salmon and our trout and our kokanee and pretty much all freshwater fish. And the government of Canada is nowhere to be found on either one of these issues, despite having all kinds of responsibilities and legislation and regulation to take care of them. So for folks, the big thing is, like I said, form letter, meeting with your MP is way up here. So the more you can do that and engage and talking to your local First Nations, we have tons of our folks and clubs who are doing projects with First Nations. We're all in this one together. And once we get it, we don't get rid of it is the thing. So the more we can lock down our borders, the better. So thanks, James. Really appreciate it. The next webinar is going to be in February, talking about fire with Jen Barron, who's a PhD. We are also trying to get one on whirling disease because the threat is just as real around whirling disease and it's knocking on our border, and the solution is the same. So thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it. James, I did put your email in the Q&A, so now everybody's got it. There were a whole bunch of people that want to volunteer and help out and do what they can. So it'll be over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, everyone, for having me again.
And thanks to Philippe and the team in our marketing communications for putting this together. I hope you all enjoyed this. If you see the recording, please share it with your friends, with your family, with your coworkers. Put it on your social media. The threat is real. We need to make sure that we protect our fresh water. Have a good night.